Hello and welcome to Nicsa Talk, the podcast for connecting and supporting the global asset management industry's greatest asset, its people. I'm Nicsa's Lovett, and today's episode is a recording of a powerfully candid conversation among 4 leaders from asset management firms entitled Listen, Learn, and Lead, a dialogue on authentic allyship. In it, they share their experiences as Black professionals at various levels of the industry and insights into how allies can best support their colleagues and combat racial injustice. Now I'll hand it off to the head of Nicsa's Diversity Project North America, Justine Phoenix.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Justine Phoenix, and I'm head of the Diversity Project North America at Nicsa. Today, we are presenting Listen, Learn, and Lead, a dialogue on authentic allyship. This program features executives from founding firms of the Diversity Project North America and our industry leaders. Nicsa launched the Diversity Project North America in 2018 in order to provide our industry with a platform to build bold business practices around DE&I. The Diversity Project is focused on promoting an inclusive asset management industry to deliver the best possible results for clients, reflect the society we serve, and ensure long-term business growth and sustainability. It's about creating workforce ecosystem changes by bringing firms together to address common issues. If you are interested in joining the Diversity Project North America, please contact me or anyone on the Nicsa staff. And be sure to follow the Diversity Project North America on LinkedIn to stay up to date on new content and more upcoming events. This presentation and the following content should be considered as off the record. Key takeaways can be gathered, but we ask that no person or firm be attributed with any specific quotes. And now, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, Steve Duncan, Senior Relationship Executive at BNY Mellon. I'll now hand the presentation over to Steve, who will start off with formal introductions and begin our content for today. Steve, please go ahead and get us started.
Thank you, Justine. Much appreciated. And thank you, Nicsa, for hosting this session. I think it's going to be a great session and one that should be very dynamic in terms of the dialogue that's up in front of us today in society and in the business sector. As mentioned, my name is Steve Duncan, Senior Relationship Executive from BNY Mellon. Been in the industry 25 years plus, predominantly in the United States, but started my career in Canada. And I enjoy, having these types of sessions and being involved in these types of sessions. And I want to thank our panelists for joining as well today. Very diverse group in terms of, companies that they come from, and diverse in terms of their thought processes. And so, again, I think we'll have an encouraging conversation today. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to India to introduce herself.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. I'm India Gary Martin. I was in the financial services industry for 25 years. I'm primarily outside of the U.S., in Asia, in Europe, and South Africa for about 20 years, and then the rest of that being in the U.S. I stopped doing that work about 6 years ago now, and I started the practice that I have now, which is an executive coaching and facilitation practice that's focused on DE&I. So my work is with CEOs and their leadership teams around the world. I'm on the coaching faculty at Georgetown University's Executive Masters in Leadership program, and I'm also a senior consultant for an organization and advisor to an organization called Intersections Partners, which helps institutions shape and define racial equity strategies. So thank you for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Great, thanks, India. I'm going to pass it over to Jason.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks a lot for having me, and really looking forward to the discussion and happy with all the energy that Nicsa's put to this effort. It's really exciting. My name is Jason Tyler. I spent the first 10 years of my career in combination of banking and capital markets at a bank in Chicago that's now part of JP Morgan. I then spent 8 years at Ariel Investments, a world-class value investment shop. And there I worked predominantly on the research side of the company. And for the last 9 years, I've been at Northern Trust, and most recently as Chief Financial Officer. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you, Jason. Much appreciated. And then finally, pass it on to you, Maurice.
Steve, thanks for having me. My name is Maurice. I'm a director at BlackRock. I sit in our global accounting and product oversight group. I'm responsible for fund administration for our infrastructure funds and also our long-term private capital funds. I've been in the industry for close to 20 years now. I started off my career in Zimbabwe at an audit firm and moved to the US to another audit firm, and then transitioned to fund administration. I've been with BlackRock for close to 3 years now. Looking forward to this discussion, Steve. Thanks.
Thanks, Maurice. Appreciate it. And so we'll start off today with, we've had some questions and some thoughts, and one of the first questions that comes to mind is, what is your interpretation of racism and what does it mean today? And I struggled with this one a little bit in the sense that I think it's meaningful in different ways to different people in different aspects, and depending on where you are in the world, it might have a different connotation. But I went up and looked it on Merriam-Webster's definition of racism, and it says it's a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. And if you focus on the one thing there, it says it's a belief. And I guess that's maybe where I would start is, whether or not you believe it. And in fact, I think Merriam-Webster had some dialogue from some folks that sort of wrote in and said they weren't necessarily sure they agreed with the definition. And in fact, Merriam-Webster is going to actually update that definition and use maybe some additional words, systematic oppression, things of that nature, because one could argue if you don't believe it, maybe you don't think there is racism. And so I want to pose that question to the panel and get their thoughts on that. And so, India, I'm going to start with you and maybe, what is your interpretation of racism and what does it mean to you today?
So I'll say that, racism, it's an emotive word, right? And that we often attribute all the things that we've ever experienced to words that appear. And, and that definition thing was really interesting that you said, because, what that sounds like to me, that definition is bias, right? Bias is about belief, whereas racism, in my experience, is about action. So when those beliefs translate to action. When I think about what racism means today, I think that far too often people try to attribute racism to people, and it's really not about people, it's about systems. People will behave in the containers that are created. So if you create containers of racism and systemic oppression, then that's how people behave. It's not even something that you think about. And when we think about the systems that were, kind of developed in the United States around racism centuries ago, some of those things still stand. And, it's kind of like, just as a quick example, it's kind of like the fact that people talk about, the relationship with the police or whatever it may be, but the police in the U.S. were founded as slave patrols. And so when you think about the fraught relationships between Black people and the police, it's because of the systemic stuff that started hundreds of years ago. So understanding the history and understanding that racism is not about people, but more about systems is where I think the disconnect is. So for me, racism is about what the systems perpetuate as opposed to individuals who live in it.
Interesting. Thank you, India. Jason, I'm going to pose that same question to you. What's your interpretation of racism and what does it mean to you today?
Yeah. So I think from a definition perspective, I think that's where it can be really hard. I think it actually is rooted in people's association with their own tribe, whatever that tribe is. And we all know humans are tribal people, and it's fundamentally the desire for your tribe to do better than another, and the belief that your tribe is better than someone else's. And I think that in terms of what it means today, I think that's super hard. I mean, I do think that right now we've blended this concept of belief and behavior, and I think it's impossible to try to convince someone that of what their beliefs are. And I think what we need to be focusing so much more on is behavior, and whether behavior is harmful and counterproductive. And so I'm very cautious about using the word. I think it's difficult to get to the point where we're discussing behavior when we're using a word that, you know, almost everyone gets very defensive around.
Interesting. Yes, great. Thank you. Maurice, sorry, I'm going to ask you the same question. What's your interpretation of racism, and what does it mean to you today?
Sure, thanks, Steve. So the way that I think about racism, I think it's multifaceted. I think it stems from both individuals and also the system. So the system, like India mentioned, you have systems that are actually put in place that are driven to deliberately keep certain races down, right? So you have systems that are in place where you're going to have limited progression of a particular group of people. And then when I also think about it from an individual perspective, a little bit different from what India's thoughts are here, but I think about it from the fact that there is bias within people, right? And that bias is pretty much people believing that they're better than others based off of their race. That bias may be driven by the environment that they grew up in, what they've been taught, or just what they see around them. But I think that bias plays a big part in how people treat each other, and it drives behavior. So I think about it from those two standpoints.
Thank you for that. And so to the listeners that are here, and I want to note that I'm looking here, I think we have over 300 attendees, so I want everyone to, one, thank you for joining, because I do think it's an important topic, and you know, one that's in the forefront of everything that we're doing today. If we pivot for a second in terms of you know, the industry itself and what it might be like to be a Black person in the global asset management industry, and I know, India, you said you've recently you know, taken on a different role, but when you're in the industry itself, and I know that you're coaching others, you know, what's your perspective of being a Black person? And I know that we, in the earlier part of our conversations, you know, you're commuting back and forth to Europe, and, you know, how do you see it? Does it seem different in America than it does in EMEA?
You know, it does to some extent. It's really interesting. I spent, you know, 15 years in London alone, you know, in addition to the other places, and it was different. But the difference is the difference between being overt and covert, right? I think in the U.S. things are much more overt, and in Europe they're much more covert, right? It's actually slightly more classist than it is racist, and by virtue of the fact that that I was in senior roles, it put me in a certain space. And so I didn't experience some of the same things. But when you talk to other Black people in the UK, that's not their experience at all. So I think, you know, it has a slightly different take, but very much the same. I was reading, there's a book that I have been reading that I'm reviewing actually called Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. And it is about that history in Britain and all the things that happened actually, which are really similar to what happened in the US, but the outcomes and the way it shows up is slightly differently. So yeah, I would say that that things are different, but that the issues that we face are the same, and that when we think about what it is to be a Black person in this industry, I mean, I was more aligned to most of my career, more aligned to investment banking, but very similarly. And it's exhausting, frankly. It's exhausting because of the things that you have to navigate, right? And I would say that, you know, people are trying to find the toolkit and trying to find the words to have conversations about this. And what I would say is ask people about their experiences, right? Ask people about what they experience in the workplace or what they've experienced in the industry, as opposed to asking, you know, what you can do to help or what you can do to support, because you can't solve for something you don't understand. And so I think the key thing for me is getting people to understand that it is challenging, that there's an extreme amount of navigation that one has to do, that we're actually taught from birth to do, and that if we're going to make shifts, then we really have to, understand that we all have different experiences, understand that people are coming to this from different places and with different lenses, and that you have to respect that everybody's not on the same place on the journey. And when you make the assumption that somebody understands your experience and you're going into a conversation, you're going to be disappointed. But that it's not the fault of anybody. What their experience is, it's kind of, we walk into our lives, we live our lives, and our lives happen essentially. And there are choices that we can make, certainly. But, just in closing, if somebody comes from a fairly homogenous environment, their kids may go to homogenous schools, maybe a homogenous place of worship, maybe, they go into work and it's fairly homogenous, then I don't have the expectation that they understand my experience. If you layer on top of that people have their own causes, it may be the Heart Foundation, the Cancer Foundation, mine is Women and Children, whatever it may be, then there's not necessarily an emotional connection to bring it to bear. So I just, for me, it's really about just understanding how challenging it is to navigate and how you start to have the conversations so that everybody feels included and has a sense of belonging.
Thank you for that perspective. That's very, very interesting. Jason, I'll ask the same question of you in terms of what it's like to be a Black person in the global asset management industry.
Well, it's frustrating, I think, in a lot of ways, and at the same time, it's exhilarating. This is the industry that we're in has emerged as one of the best industries you can have a profession in. You can build wealth for your family. You can test your academic strength versus others. You can be part of privately held companies, publicly traded companies. It's a phenomenal industry, and the barriers to entry are just have to do with your passion around the markets and doing well. And so all that is fabulous. The frustrating part is that it's still not a fair playing field in how these fabulous jobs at the upper end are disseminated. And it's not done fairly today. And despite the fact that there's so much scrutiny and so many eyes on it, and these are the smartest people some of the smartest people in the world or in the asset management industry, and yet we still struggle, and we look every day at companies that have absolutely no representation of Black people and women and Latinos at the top of their management teams, and it's tolerated. And so that part's incredibly frustrating. And then when people do well, they get scrutinized for how they got there. And so, I'm optimistic about it. I spent a lot of time pushing hard and working on this, but I also am cognizant that it's a very difficult time for a lot of very talented people up and down the spectrum, from people that are 22 to people that are 62, that think that they should be doing better and get a bigger influence in this wonderful industry that we're in.
I really appreciate that response, Jason. I'm going to hold on to a couple of things there because I want to go back to them on those. But Maurice, I'm going to give you an opportunity maybe to build on what Jason just said. And again, you might have a different perspective from coming overseas. How do you view yourself as being Black in the global asset management industry?
So I think it comes with challenges, like Jason said, right? I think about two things when I'm thinking about the industry. I think about equality and I also think about equity, right? So within those two things, when you think about equality, are you viewed the same as your counterparts? And the answer to that is no, right? And then when it comes to equity, when an opportunity comes up, right, do you have the same shot at that opportunity that has come up? And the answer to that is no, right? So I think there has been some shift in terms of people starting to think about this being actually highlighted in the industry, and some of the industry leaders starting to take action, but it's not everybody who has taken action. So I think up until we have a whole change within the entire industry, it's always going to be a challenge when you don't have a level playing field.
And so on that, and Jason, I'm going to go back to you for a second, because I think you raised some interesting points, and I think you're absolutely right that it's a wonderful industry to be in, and one that typically is judged on performance. Every company has metrics, sales metrics, expense metrics, profitability metrics, and yet there doesn't ever seem to be a metric out there for diversity. And, or if there is, it seems unattainable, or, you know, it's just a number. And are we chasing the right thing from a numbers perspective, or should it just be ingrained in companies that, you know, having diversity means you have diverse opinions and diverse views, and people might look differently? And so, like, how do you start changing that thought process? If there's one, if you have one thing that you could point to, what would you challenge folks with that are on this call today?
It would be to, you know, throw away the brochures that people try to give you that show diversity in their organization, and force firms to focus on what matters, which is, what does the leadership of the firm look like? And that is something that can be easily measured. And just ask, what is the top level leadership of the firm, and what is the representation of women and minorities at that level, period. And don't let people tell you about hiring 22-year-olds, and don't let them tell you about the board, you know, as much about the board of directors, which is also important, but focus on the leadership of the firm, because that's what will drive better behavior up and down. And the more we let people talk about what they're doing in hiring interns and hiring incoming classes, you know, firms have been talking about that for 30 years, and things still don't look different. And so unless we can be laser focused on, you know, are you hiring and promoting senior level minorities and women, and are we hiring diverse owned firms, laser focused on those topics? And that can be very quantified. It can just be, what is the, I ask this question every time I'm in front of a potential vendor, and every time I look at an annual report, I check for it as a litmus test to see what the firm is like. And you know, the older I get, the less afraid I am of asking those questions. And I do it in an extremely quantitative manner, and don't tolerate brochures.
That's great. I really like that. And I from a personal experience, you know, I've got an older son who's joined the workforce, and had similar conversations with him. And I think you're spot on in terms of looking at the makeup of the executive company, or the executives within the company, and that really should dictate sort of your decision-making process in terms of, you know, what do you see and where do you want it to go? And I think companies have been at this for a while. So, you know, when you see turnover, and then you see people being replaced with the same type of people, you know, you got to question yourself in terms of, is that the place that you want to be? And to your earlier point, you know, you could do all the great recruiting, but as they move up in the sort of ladder in terms of responsibility in the organization, you know, do you see that same makeup like making its way up through the company itself? So I'm glad you brought that up. India, turning to you, you know, can you share any personal accounts or situations that you felt like an outsider inside this industry?
Sure, I can probably more than I can count, but I'll choose one or two that's fairly poignant. I just want to say one thing though about what Jason said, which is so important, and that was that thing about representation. Because just to be really clear, when we talk about retention in our industry and talk about being able to retain people, because people will come in, but the question is, can we keep them? When people don't see folks who look like them in leadership seats, it means there's no path for me. So that, and that has, it is such a big deal when you think about how you motivate people to want to stay and how you grow people through the ranks. You can do as much as you want around development. The messaging when they don't see somebody who looks like them is there's no space for me at that seat or at that table. So that's one thing. And in terms of my my personal experience and feeling like an outsider, so you know, I'm Black, I'm a woman, and I was operating. So I worked in the front, middle, and back office spaces in a number of the firms that I've worked in, and ones that you'll know. So I was at J.P. Morgan, I was at Lehman. It wasn't my fault. I was at Deutsche Bank. So I've been in some fairly big firms, and I often felt like I didn't belong. And as I became more senior, that became more acute. And a part of that was because I felt like I had a responsibility. Every woman who had an issue, every person of color who had an issue wanted to talk to me about their issues. And I'm not saying that in a bad way. I felt responsible and wanted to be able to do that, but the burden's a really heavy one to carry. And it wasn't one that I felt like I could share with other people because, because I was the only one, whenever, people needed to talk about the things that they've faced, that they understood that I uniquely as a woman first or second, and as a Black person first or second, depending on the lens, faced, they would come and talk to me. And that is heavy. And actually, it's one of the reasons in the end that I decided to step out. At the end of my career, I had a 15,000 person team in 40 countries and a multi-billion-dollar a year budget. But the weight was too much, and I felt like I didn't have the support, and it wasn't intentional. But you can kind of continue banging on, and when you don't feel heard, it doesn't matter what level of the organization you're at. Eventually, it just becomes too exhausting. And yes, I could have pushed through it. I'd done my 25 years, so I was kind of coming to my own shelf life in the space, as it were. But that sense of not feeling like I was a part of that club, going to offsites and, again, being the only woman and only person of color. And the idea was, let's go play golf. I didn't play golf. And that's a gender thing perhaps. But my point is, there have been lots of situations, and inclusion is about ensuring that everybody feels a sense of belonging in the space. And that takes effort, right? It takes intentional effort. But there are, again, I'll go back to the systemic changes, because individuals can make those changes. But if we don't create the container for the behavior, for the cultures to shift in organizations, then we're going to continue to perpetuate the same kinds of things, and people are going to continue to have the same kinds of experiences.
Thank you for that perspective. And Maurice, I guess I'm going to pivot again a little bit here in terms of privilege, and what's your interpretation of privilege, and how does it play a role in the industry? Just curious on your thoughts around that thought process.
Sure. So when I think about privilege, I think about unfair advantage that has been given to either a group of people or an individual. So it comes back to the absence of a level playing field in any environment. Some people are going to get favor based off of color of their skin or based off of gender. So when you think about some of the people that sit at the top in the industry, right, that's driven by their race. They got there because of their race. And some people that are at the bottom cannot progress simply because of race. So to go back to what Jason mentioned a few minutes ago, when you think about the lack of representation further up the chain within the industry, that lack of representation is concerning. If we actually do get that representation up top, we do need to have a voice at the table. So we need to make sure that we're actually empowering people as they move up within the industry, empowering those people to make sure that once they're retained within the industry, they can actually progress and move further up. And when they're up there, they actually have a voice at the table. I'll give you an example. In South Africa, they tried to push for Black economic empowerment. India, you might be familiar with this. But the way that it was done, it was just simply having heads that are up there so that you get an account, so that you just check off the box that, okay, we actually have Black people in those positions, right? But those people actually don't have any power. When it comes to decision making within their companies, right, nobody turns to them in terms of decision making. Decision making is still retained by other people that are not Black within the company. So when I think about privilege, it's that unfair advantage that people have either in terms of decision making or in terms of progression.
That's great. I really like that. And in fact, for folks that are listening on the phone, and I struggled with this a little bit in terms of privilege and whether or not if you're not a minority, however you view yourself, and do you feel like you have privilege over others? And I guess I would ask folks to look yourself in the mirror and check yourself and ask that question. And what can you do for folks that don't necessarily look like you, that might be a minority, and how could you help them move along in terms of their career path? Because I think India, you said it earlier, some of it might be overt, some of it might be covert. some of it might be implicit bias, some might be explicit bias, and I think we all have to take a look at that and sort of challenge ourselves on those situations and whether or not we're willing to stand up and make a difference. So I think these are all things that are resonating, at least with me, and hopefully will resonate with the audience. Maybe to you, Jason, in terms of privilege and how do you view it from your perspective?
Well, I do think that it's a real issue in our industry, in that in some ways there's this false sense that people have that the asset management industry is all about how well you do. It's all about what your investment returns are, or what your client relationship management statistics look like. But the reality is it's extremely subjective how roles are given. And this is an industry that values intelligence so much, and intelligence isn't just about writing, and it's not always about content. It's so much about the impression that we make and how we present. And that is so incredibly subjective. And then the experiences just in and of themselves, of how people have experiences that, whether it's traveling, and think about how great it sounds that India is talking about her travels around the world. It's phenomenal. It gives her valid credibility when she's talking to people about what she's doing. But think about the fact that so many people that are Black don't have the ability to travel or to have experiences that can bring that type of credibility. And so privilege, and that all plays into how they end up presenting in a sales pitch to senior leadership. And so I think it's so important for us to try and share the privileges and give privileges to others, whether it's just access and hearing the thoughts of leaders. I've learned so much just being in the same room as some of the best leaders in the asset management industry. And I know that's helped me as I've been able to take insights or share experiences about that, and clearly playing in terms of how people are promoted and hired.
Yeah, that's great. And actually, it's a good segue then, Jason, into sort of the next question here of, can we share examples of where and when an ally can help and how important are mentors? And I'll start off by just saying I really believe to be successful in the financial industry, and probably most industries, is you need a mentor. And if you just think about your personal life, right, you want to have a mentor, you want to have someone that's going to be your ally. And I think it's got to work both ways in terms of having a mentor and a mentee, right? The mentor has got to want to do it, and they're going to do it with their undivided attention, and they're going to be persistent on it, and they're going to want to help. And I think from the mentee perspective, they're going to have to latch on, and you're going to find someone that wants to help you. I go back to my oldest son in terms of, you got to build relationships, right? It's not a one and done. It's something that's going to be built over time. And someone's going to see who you are and the credibility that you bring to the table. And then I think they'll latch on and want to help. So that's my personal experience. And I know that when I was going through and sort of growing up in the industry, I had folks that wanted to help me, didn't look at the color of my skin, challenged me on the way that I approached things within the firm, or how I did certain things in terms of just, challenging me. And I hopefully grew from that perspective. And so maybe to you, Maurice, and I'm going to ask the question of everyone on the panel. I think you've all been very successful. So maybe give me an example of an ally or mentor that worked with you. Maurice, do we still have you?
Yep, I'm here. So if we can just start on the mentor. So a mentor is somebody who gives you advice, who helps guide you in the right direction, who is somebody who's going to be a sounding wall. If you have any thoughts, you can go and bounce ideas off of that person. They're not necessarily somebody who will make a decision for you, but they'll help you make a decision. A mentor is supposed to be somebody who is a role model to you, and who you can share experiences with. So I think just in the industry, right, It's also helpful to have a mentor who's actually had experiences, somebody who can actually relate to you. Somebody who's actually experienced something is different from somebody who knows something through empathy, because somebody has heard of somebody's experiences. So a Black mentor will be somebody who's good to have, just from the simple fact that they have gone through some of these experiences and they can help you navigate some of those experiences. And then when I think about allyship and the importance of allyship, whenever you're in a situation, you can have somebody who just stands by and witnesses, or you can have somebody who will speak up for you. In some instances, you might not have the strength, or you might not have the mental capability for you to actually speak up, right? So whenever you have an ally, that ally is going to speak up for you, help you push your cause, and that's going to be like pretty key in terms of what we're trying to drive here. So I personally have a very good mentor who's been there for me, who has been very understanding, who has helped me navigate. They listen, and they actually try to put themselves in my shoes every time that I'm talking about something. They do not make any issue about them, but it's always about me, which is very, very key when you have a mentor.
Great, thanks for that perspective. And folks that are on the phone, we're starting to see some questions come through, and that was one of the questions was, what's the difference between an ally and mentor? So I think, Maurice, maybe you touched on that. Jason, as it relates to you, can you give me an example of a mentor and ally that you've worked with?
Maybe quickly, I'll do two, just to reference how different they can be. The first is, one of the incredible amount of luck when I was really young to get exposed to John Rogers, who started Ariel Investments, who's been a lifelong friend and mentor, and was talking to him last night about about a range of things, and the thing about all mentors is that they'll see the best in you, and they, which can be good and bad. They'll give you opportunities to do things that you might not even be ready for sometimes, but on the other hand, they can also ruin your day, because they want you to do well, and they will tell you when you're not doing well. And John's always done both. He gave me opportunities to do things, long before I probably earned them, but he also held me accountable to doing them at a high level, and I always knew he wanted me to do well. And then second, which is I think more applicable for the audience today, is I should mention Heidi Miller, who was CFO of Bank One when I was there, and she and I crossed paths not frequently, but she encouraged me to come work in finance, and it was a career-changing moment for me. And here was a white woman who was closer to the end of her career than the beginning of her career, and she clearly just wanted to take a shot, and got me exposure to how to lead a financial services company from a finance perspective. And it is not coincidence that I'm in the role that I am now, given the time I saw her managing finance at Bank One and the exposure I had to Jamie at the time. And so the reason I bring that up is I think sometimes people look for mentors that are too much like them demographically, and you don't have to do that. It's sometimes the best mentors look very different than you. What is consistent about all good mentors is that they see something great in you, and when you find people that you respect, that you connect with, that seem to see greatness in you, just don't leave that. Hold on to it, work with them, work around them, deliver on your commitments to them, and keep that going.
I love that perspective. I truly agree with you. Couldn't agree with you more. And we got a note that came through, Shonda, someone that was listening in here, that says that mentors are incredibly important, but even more important in the industry are active sponsors. So I think that resonates as well, as you've mentioned, those folks that you've dealt with, Jason, that really sort of took you by the horn and said they wanted to help you and make it better for you in terms of moving along in your career. I have a question that came in, this question to the panel. India said individuals can make changes, but the system has to change. How can people change the system? Are there good examples that anyone could point to? So India, I'm going to put you on the spot, and maybe you could maybe ask that, try to answer some of that part of that question.
Sure. So when I talk about systems, it doesn't absolve people of doing the work by any stretch of the imagination. It is, when I talk about systems and what people can do, it starts, if you're thinking organizationally, if you think about what you can do in your individual workspace, it is the audits of, so one of the things that I work on are systems audits in organizations and companies, policies and standards audits, recruiting audits, retention audits. So what are the things that are happening and why are we not able to retain? Or what are the things that are so built into our systems? When you think about organizations, most financial services organizations, asset managers included, a lot of them have been around for decades and some even centuries, right? And though policies and standards evolve to some extent, they are not things that we typically go back and have a look at kind of whole hog and kind of check what things may be there inadvertently. They're unconscious. It's unconscious bias. It is not things that folks have done intentionally, but often things are written in a way that bias isn't checked. And so when you talk about what you can do for systems in an organization, it's starting to do some of those audits, starting to audit the actual systems in which we operate, audit our retention processes, audit our recruitment processes, check for unconscious bias, check for implicit bias, which is different than unconscious bias. Unconscious bias is stuff that you don't know about, the decisions you make in a second based upon your own experience. Implicit bias is when you are starting to understand those biases but haven't started to interrupt them yet. So it's kind of taking a process, taking a step down that process and starting to look at processes inside of your organizations, which is how you start to address the systems. And again, people operate in the containers that systems create, right? And those behaviors are very driven to culture that's inside of an organization and the systems that are inside of an organization. So what you do is start to look at the systems inside of the organization first to start to shape some of the behaviors.
Interesting. Maurice, I have a question for you that, not to you specifically, but one that came in, and maybe you'll have a different perspective on it. Can you explain the disparity in the United States due to racism and not class? Most examples that I've heard presented here are directly tied to class. And you might have a different perspective coming from South Africa, or Zimbabwe, I think it was, sorry. What's your perspective on that?
So coming from Zimbabwe, there's a lot of classism in that country. So predominantly Black society. You do have some white folks that are included in there, but even within like the Black folks themselves, there's a lot of classism. So when we start to break down the bias that India just mentioned right now, sometimes people have bias even within their own societies. Like you can have Black on Black bias. And a lot of that Black on Black bias would drive a lot of the classism that happens, even among Black people. So you have a group of people who think that, hey, I'm better than everybody else, right, because of the amount of money that I have. And then you do also still have racism, even within that society. You have a small amount of the population that is controlling a lot of the resources within that space. And then compared to what we see here in the United States, so I think in the United States, it's more of racism when I'm thinking about it. It's more of racism more than classism compared to what you would see in Zimbabwe, where it came from. The racism here is, the oppression that we just spoke about, and also the systems that have been put in place to deliberately keep a certain race or a group of people down. That's what I would say is more predominant here.
Great, thank you for that perspective. I have a couple interesting questions that came in here, and I think we talked about this a little bit during the prep session. So here's one. How do I speak up without hurting personal and professional relationships? Jason, I'm going to throw that one out to you. I have some perspective as well, but I'd like to get your view on it.
Sure. Yeah, it's a good segue from talking about mentors. It's something John Rogers talks about a lot. You can't get in trouble for asking questions. And I think it is hard when you're giving an opinion or you start with a statement or a judgment that can hurt people's feelings or get people upset or defensive. But if you're asking a question sincerely or asking for facts, then people should be able to get upset. And that's why earlier I was saying if you just ask for a set of facts, what is the percentage of women and minorities on senior leadership? And those types of facts, if you ask for, then you have to trust in some way that people will see what the conclusion is. And we're talking about really thoughtful, bright senior executives that we're all trying to influence. And there is going too far. If you tell people what they have to do, unless things have gotten so far afield. But if you're trying to move an organization the right way and someone's coming at it from the right spirit, if you just ask questions and ask for facts in a really tight way, then I think that's the best way to approach this situation without creating defensiveness or anger.
Interesting. Thank you for that response. And there's questions are flowing in right now. And I know we've got 13 minutes here. I want to try to get to most of these questions. So one that's come through, I'm summarizing a little bit here, but I strongly support the notion that gender and color diversity should be the focus of the industry. Some of my gay peers might not agree with me. How do I determine what type of diversity is the right one to focus on, where we might disappoint some in an effort to achieve attainable goals? India, could maybe you comment on that one?
Yeah, sure. I think, I don't think that there's any pillar of diversity that's more important than any other. However, when you think about how diversity is shaped in organizations, say over the last 20 years, the last 20 or 25 years, most corporations set up these diversity and inclusion functions, right? And when you think about the progress that's been made, everybody focused on women, right? Gender was a thing that everybody could do and do easily, and that's what everybody did. And every other diverse pillar had some levels of success or not, but women were the one that was out front. Now we're in an age, right? When you think about what's happening to Black people in America and just calling it what it is and talking about it, the reason that we are where we are is because of all the things that have happened over, again, centuries that have brought us to this point. And so it is important that we focus on that right now, understanding that the most difficult ones, race is hard. It is difficult to talk about. People don't feel like they have the toolkits. Societally, we haven't been able to do it for 400 years. It's now been thrust upon us. We're expecting people in organizations to be able to do it. It's hard. But if you can solve for that one, then the other ones come up naturally as a result of that, right? And so I don't think it's about choosing. It's about figuring out how we solve the issue that's in front of us and how that might help other groups, because that's inevitably what it is. Underrepresented groups are underrepresented groups. And many of us in underrepresented groups face very similar challenges. For us, and again, it's subjective, right? It's about you, it's personal, it's about what you experience in your skin, right? And if you're in an underrepresented group, it's going to feel pretty difficult no matter what. However, as I just mentioned, if you look at what that means for Black people, if you look at the rate that Black people are killed by the police, if you look at health inequity, if you look at educational inequity, if you look at all the different measures across the country and where Black people fit in comparison to the fact that a lot of, particularly African Americans, have been here for several generations, then we need to figure out what the problem is there. And I think starting that will help the other groups too. So I know that was a long answer, but I hope it gives some perspective.
No, I think that's great. Thank you. I'm going to take a couple more questions here from the audience. One way I believe that we can improve the industry as it relates to race is to foster honest conversations among employees about the issues such that white employees might hear the experiences of their colleagues of color. How do we create those conversations when companies might be concerned about liability, legal or otherwise? They may be exposed to it as a result. So I'm going to take that one myself, and I feel like we have to have the conversations. And I think, similar to some of the things that Jason had mentioned in terms of allies and mentors, and I think you have to find a safe zone. I think, some people might be open and willing to talk about it. I'm very transparent, and if someone comes to me, and a colleague did come up to me, and, we spent 30, 45 minutes talking about it, I think you've got to accept that responsibility. Some may not want that responsibility, but I think you have to have those tough conversations. And I think if you feel like there's some liability concerns, sure, there's always going to be those types of concerns. But I think if you're, respectful of it, you're professional about the conversation, and you're probing, you just want to learn, and maybe you do some of that homework on your own before having the conversation. I think it's something that's acceptable, especially in this day and age. And I don't think not having the conversation is going to help. I think sitting by silently is not necessarily where we want to be today. So, from my perspective, I think having that conversation certainly makes a lot of sense. I'm going to ask a question.
If I can just add.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, if I can just quickly add to what you just said. I think also the tone at the top also matters, right? So in an organization where you see leaders start to speak up and engage in those kind of conversations, it makes everybody else more comfortable to actually engage in those kind of conversations. So it's the environment that leadership is also fostering within any organization that actually enables people to have those conversations, have awkward conversations be not as awkward, right? Because they become normal. People can actually talk about these things, and people aren't worrying about there's liability issues because you've actually seen your leaders within the organization also engage in those types of conversations.
Thank you, Maurice. Appreciate that. I'm going to summarize a few questions here, and it's the question was working from home, interviewing. How do you affect diversity when you may never actually see the color of this person's skin? There's another question around interns in diversity from that perspective, and how do we make sure we're having inclusion? What I would say to that perspective, I challenge your HR partners, your diversity partners. Do some of your homework, whether it's on LinkedIn or Google searches. Again, I think if you really want to find, ideal candidates, where are you recruiting from historically Black universities and colleges? You've got to work at this. This is not something that's just going to come easy. You've got to want to make that effort and make that change. But certainly, I think there's a lot of resources that are available internal to most firms and probably externally. And I'm sure you can reach out to India as well. But I definitely think there's opportunities to make sure that you're finding the right candidates in the right places. I know we got a few minutes left here, so I want to make sure I ask this question to each of you on the panel. If you had one takeaway for our listeners today, what it would be for you, and what would you view as success in terms of today's session and something that our listeners can take away to their firms. So India, I'll start with you.
Thank you. I would say that, conversations about race, as I always say, are hard. They're really challenging. And that before you think about anything, you have to remember that people come with their individual experiences. They come with their individual lenses, which we all have to respect. People land where they are because that's who they are. And that's where we start. And so I would just say that you have to grant people grace in the conversations, understanding that we don't all have the toolkits, we don't all have the language, we don't all have the words, but that where there's intention, we need to grant people grace and kindness when we enter into conversations that are so emotive.
Thank you, India. Maurice, I'm going to pass that same question on to you.
Yep. I would take away the value of allies within what we're going through right now. There's a lot of value there. Allies are going to help us be a voice in what we're trying to change here. So do not be a witness, be an ally. If you can join any sort of groups where you can actually understand what people are going through a lot more, join even Black networks or Spanish networks or women networks, just to understand what people are going through. That will help you be more empathetic and it will help you in your position as an ally. So allyship is a big takeaway for me from this.
Okay, great. And Jason, I'll finish up with you.
Sure. Well, I think it's this concept of balancing this optimism that I have for the industry and how great it is and the opportunities it gives us all, with this consistent pressure that we all need to put on the system in a laser-like focus on numbers, and throwing away the brochures and focusing on the area that is going to move the needle, while at the same time coming with a positive attitude that we're all so lucky to be in this industry. We just have to demand more of it.
That's great. Appreciate it. From my perspective, I hope the dialogue keeps happening. And in fact, I think we've got a question or a comment about, this has been a great session. It's tough to cover a lot of the information that we'd love to cover in an hour. And so I'm not sure, Jordan, who's putting in the session on from Nicsa perspective, if there'll be other further sessions on this perspective, but definitely could tell by the number of attendees and the number of questions that are coming through that the dialogue is important. And I think if we leave with this, leave with anything from this session, is just to keep the dialogue going. Hold your company leaders accountable. Hold your managers accountable, hold yourself accountable, quite frankly. I think we all have some unconscious biases, and I think you have to check them at the door, and I think you have to keep reminding yourself when you see something or you hear something and you don't think it looks right, or you want to make a change within your firm or your company, you got to stand up. And sometimes, standing up is the difficult thing to do, and you don't want to be that outlier, but you'd be probably surprised that there's others that feel the same way as you in terms of wanting to make a difference. So that's great. Appreciate it. From my perspective, I hope the dialogue keeps happening. And in fact, I think we've got a question or a comment about, this has been a great session. It's tough to cover a lot of the information that we'd love to cover in an hour. And so I'm not sure, Jordan, who's putting in the session on from Nicsa perspective, if there'll be other further sessions on this perspective, but definitely could tell by the number of attendees and the number of questions that are coming through that the dialogue is important. And I think if we leave with this, leave with anything from this session, is just to keep the dialogue going. Hold your company leaders accountable. Hold your managers accountable, hold yourself accountable, quite frankly. I think we all have some unconscious biases, and I think you have to check them at the door, and I think you have to keep reminding yourself when you see something or you hear something and you don't think it looks right, or you want to make a change within your firm or your company, you got to stand up. And sometimes, standing up is the difficult thing to do, and you don't want to be that outlier, but you'd be probably surprised that there's others that feel the same way as you in terms of wanting to make a difference. So from that perspective, I think everyone should challenge themselves and be proud of the things they're doing.
You've been listening to Nicsa Talk. Nicsa is a trade association in support of professionals within the global financial community. Come back often and feel free to add our podcast to your favorite RSS feed or follow us on Twitter at Nicsa News. For information on how your firm can become a Nicsa member, please visit nicsa.org and view our membership page. For over 50 years, Nicsa has been connecting global asset management participants to discuss and develop industry best practices. Join the conversation today.